It started one night, a few weeks ago. I had been sleeping in my bed like any other night when I woke up to the sound of static. It wasn't just a faint background noise, it was loud and unsettling, like the TV had been left on with no signal. But when I opened my eyes, I saw the TV in the living room was off. I figured it was just some kind of glitch, so I went back to sleep, dismissing it. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. The static. The TV still off. And something else, something I couldn't explain. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought it was a coincidence. But after a few days, I started to get paranoid. The static wasn't just random noise anymore. It felt deliberate, like something, or someone was trying to get my attention. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, walked into the living room, and checked the TV. It was off just like it should have been. But when I looked closer, I noticed something strange. There was a shadow in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. It was hard to make out, like it was watching me. I turned on all the lights, and tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. But it didn't stop. Every time I went to sleep, I'd wake up to that same static, and every time, the shadow would be there. It was as if it was growing stronger, moving closer. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, like I couldn't escape it. I even tried unplugging the TV before bed, thinking maybe that would stop it. But the next morning, the TV would be plugged back in, and the static would still be there. It was always there. I was completely losing my grip. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything else. It was like I was becoming a prisoner in my own home. I started doing research, looking for answers. I found a few stories online, people who had similar experiences with their TVs. Some of them called it the haunted static, while others thought it was some kind of paranormal entity trying to communicate. But none of those explanations seemed to fit. I wasn't hearing voices or seeing any kind of figure. It was just the static and that damn shadow moving across the room. I tried to find some logical explanation, maybe electrical interference, maybe something with the wiring in my building. I called an electrician, hoping he could find something wrong with the apartment's electrical system. But when he came over and checked everything, he couldn't find a thing. The wiring was fine. There was nothing unusual going on with the power. It felt like no matter how much I tried to explain it, the situation was just beyond anything rational. Every night, I was left in terror, waiting for the moment when the TV would turn itself on, and the shadow would return, creeping across my apartment as if it were alive. At this point, I stopped even trying to figure it out. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't stop it. The shadow seemed to get closer each time, and the static began to feel more oppressive, like it was filling the room, suffocating me. I couldn't sleep with the TV on anymore. I couldn't even look at it without feeling like something was watching me. It was so bad that I started sleeping with the lights on, the curtains pulled tight, hoping that would somehow keep whatever it was at bay. But it didn't help. No matter how much I tried to protect myself, I still woke up to that same horrible static, like it was waiting for me. One night, after another sleepless evening, I decided to do something drastic. I went out and bought a hammer. I was going to destroy the TV. It didn't matter if it was a new one. It didn't matter if I could never watch anything again. I just needed to end this. When I got home, I took the hammer and smashed the screen, over and over. It felt good to break it, to get rid of that thing that had haunted me for weeks. But when the dust settled and I stood there, breathing heavily, I realized something. The TV was still on. I couldn't believe my eyes. The TV screen, shattered and broken, was still glowing with that static. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the broken remnants of what should have been a dead device. There was no logical explanation for it. I had destroyed it, completely destroyed it, and yet it was still on. The static seemed louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel that suffocating presence growing stronger in the room. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. It was then that I noticed something else. The shadow was back, and this time, it was right there in front of me. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. The temperature in the room dropped, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I was frozen, unable to move, as the shadow seemed to stretch and writhe in front of me, as if it was alive, a dark presence that wanted something from me. The static continued to pulse in rhythm with the beating of my heart, and I could hear a faint whisper, barely audible, like someone was speaking just out of reach. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room went silent, the shadow vanished, and the static on the broken TV turned to blackness. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there, gasping for air. The weight that had been pressing down on me lifted, but the terror remained. I didn't know what had just happened, or how it had happened. I didn't know if I had just imagined it all, or if something real had just occurred. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of that apartment, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the broken TV, wondering if it would happen again. The silence was unbearable. I couldn't bring myself to look at the TV again, afraid that if I did, the static would start all over again. I didn't know how much longer I stood there, paralyzed in place, just waiting for the next strange thing to happen. But nothing did. The shadow was gone, the static was gone, and for the first time in weeks, my apartment felt like it was mine again. I sat down on the floor, exhausted, feeling like I had just been through a nightmare. I told myself it was over, that I had finally put an end to whatever was haunting me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I tried to act like everything was fine. I cleaned up the broken TV, threw out the pieces, and tried to put the whole thing behind me. But when I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I kept the lights on, just in case, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I could hear the static, like it was just waiting for me to fall asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was check the living room, half expecting to see the TV still glowing. But there was nothing. Everything was normal, just like it had been before. I thought maybe I was just imagining things. After all, I had gone through so much, and it wouldn't be the first time my mind had played tricks on me. But then came the next night. I had a hard time sleeping, tossing and turning in bed, afraid to let my guard down. And when I finally did manage to fall asleep, I woke up to the same feeling, the weight in the air, like something was there, just beyond my sight. The static had returned, faint but unmistakable. I got up, my heart racing, and went to the living room. The TV was off, just like I had left it, but the sound, the static, was still there. I stood frozen in the doorway for a long time, listening. It wasn't coming from the TV. It was coming from the walls, or from inside my head. It was everywhere. I couldn't tell if it was real anymore, or if I was losing my mind. The static intensified, almost to the point of being unbearable. And then, I saw it again. The shadow. This time, it was standing still, right in front of the broken TV, but it was different. It wasn't moving. It was just watching me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared before, it vanished, leaving only the silence and the feeling of being watched. I didn't know what to think anymore. I didn't know what was happening, or why it was happening to me. My life had become a constant cycle of fear and confusion. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight, and worst of all, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was just waiting, watching, always one step ahead of me. It wasn't like before. It wasn't just the static or the shadow anymore. It was this presence. It felt like it was inside my mind, like it had planted itself there, and it wasn't going to leave until it had what it wanted. But that was the last time I saw the shadow. The last time I heard the static. After that night, everything went quiet. For weeks, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself it had all been a nightmare, something my mind had conjured up out of stress and exhaustion. But I knew deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Something was waiting for me. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, I couldn't. The TV, the static, the shadow, it had all stopped, but it hadn't gone away. After the silence of the last few weeks, I thought I could finally breathe easy. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The quiet had left me feeling uneasy, like the calm before a storm. I tried to convince myself it was all just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lingering just beyond the corner of my vision. Every time I turned a corner in my apartment, I'd feel a brief, inexplicable shiver, as if someone was standing there. But when I'd look, there'd be nothing. I tried to go back to normal. I started working from home again, watching TV, reading. Anything to distract myself. But even in the middle of the day, in the safety of daylight, I still couldn't shake that heavy feeling. One evening, after a long day of work, I sat down on my couch, trying to relax. But before I could even settle in, I noticed it again. The faint hum. The static. It wasn't loud at first, just a whispering sound in the background, but it was unmistakable. I froze, my heart racing. It was happening again. I quickly turned off the TV, thinking maybe it was just some leftover glitch from the night before. But the static didn't stop. It kept going, louder this time, coming from the walls, the air, as if it were everywhere. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away on its own, but it only grew louder, more persistent. It felt like something was crawling under my skin, making me feel sick to my stomach. I stood up, my legs shaking, and went to check the TV again. This time, I didn't even bother with the remote. I just unplugged it. But still, the static didn't stop. It was like the air was alive with it, crackling in my ears. I turned around, desperate for an answer, and there it was. The shadow. This time, it was standing by the door as if waiting for me. I couldn't see its shape clearly, but I could feel it there looming. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my mind racing. I had no idea what this thing was or why it kept coming back, but I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't going to let me go. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was just exhausted, that I was hallucinating from the stress. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. The shadow wasn't just some figment of my imagination, and neither was the static. They were real, and they were after something. I didn't know what, but it was clear I couldn't escape it. I had tried everything, destroying the TV, unplugging it, leaving the apartment for a while, but nothing worked. That night, I decided to do something different. I couldn't keep running from this thing, so I tried to confront it. I sat down in front of the TV, facing it head-on, willing myself to stay calm. I watched the screen, waiting for the static to appear. But nothing happened. The TV stayed off. The air was still. I thought maybe I had finally won, but then I heard it. A faint whisper. Just barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from the TV, but not from the speakers. It was coming from the screen itself. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't like before. The static had always been just noise, but this felt different. The whisper wasn't just a sound. It was like someone was speaking to me, but I couldn't understand the words. It was as if the screen itself was alive, like it was trying to communicate with me. I reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the screen. The moment my fingers made contact, the whisper stopped. The static faded away, and the room fell silent once again. I didn't know what to think. Part of me was relieved that the noise had stopped, but another part of me was terrified by what had just happened. What was that whisper? What did it want from me? I didn't know, but I was starting to feel like I would never get an answer. The shadow had disappeared again, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it came back. It always did. And the static, it was like a constant reminder that something was waiting for me, lurking just out of sight. Days passed, and the static remained quiet, but the feeling of being watched never left. I started to lose sleep again, waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of the static, only to find the TV off and the room empty. It was as if the world around me was shifting, becoming darker and more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been tormenting me was getting stronger, that it was building up to something worse. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, but every time the static returned, every time I saw that shadow, I knew something had changed. Then came the night when it all changed again. I had just finished eating dinner and was sitting on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, when I heard a sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like the sound of a TV turning on. My heart skipped a beat as I looked up, expecting to see the screen glowing with static. But instead, I saw something even worse. The shadow was no longer just a shape. It was solid, dark, and looming in the doorway. It wasn't watching me anymore. It was moving. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The shadow was no longer just a faint, fleeting thing. It was there, in the doorway, growing larger by the second. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It didn't move like a normal person, not even like something human. It was a dark, shifting mass, like smoke swirling in on itself. It didn't have a face, no eyes to stare into, but I could feel it looking at me. I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. Then, the whispering started again. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't distant or static-filled. It was close, right in my ear, as if the shadow was speaking directly to me. But the words, if they were even words, were unintelligible. They were garbled, like a language I couldn't comprehend. My mind screamed for me to understand, but it was like the sounds were deliberately kept just out of reach. I clutched my head, trying to block out the noise, but it only got louder, more intense. It felt like the very air around me was vibrating with the sound. I stood up, finally able to move, though my legs felt weak beneath me. I backed away from the shadow, but it followed me, gliding across the floor without making a sound. It was like it was alive, like it was feeding off my fear. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. I had to get out. I had to escape. But as I pulled the door open, a sudden chill swept over me, and the shadow surged forward, blocking my path. My heart hammered in my chest as I slammed the door shut, feeling the weight of it pressing against me. It wasn't just standing in the doorway anymore. It was inside, in the room with me, and I had no idea how to fight it. I could feel its presence pushing against me, suffocating me, like a dark fog filling the air. The whispering turned into something more coherent now, though it still made no sense. It felt like it was coming from all around me, the walls, the ceiling, the very ground beneath me. There was nowhere to hide, no escape. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, and nothing came out. I stumbled backward, my eyes desperately searching for something, anything, that could help. And then I saw it. The TV. It was turned on again. The static was there, but this time it wasn't just noise. It was a swirling, chaotic mess of white and black, like a storm was brewing inside the screen. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The static seemed to reach out toward me, like it was trying to drag me in. It felt alive. It felt like it was pulling me closer, like I had no choice but to get closer to it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, my body completely out of my control. The shadow was getting closer now, moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps. Its presence seemed to fill the room, pressing down on me. I could feel it inside my chest, deep in my bones. It was like it was inside my head, inside my thoughts, and I couldn't stop it. And then, as if everything were happening in slow motion, the static on the TV started to change. The screen flickered, and I saw someone, inside the static. A face. It wasn't clear at first, but as the image became sharper, I recognized it. It was me. But it wasn't just me. The figure on the screen was smiling. It was smiling at me in a way that wasn't right, a way that made my skin crawl. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped. I could feel the shadow closing in, its presence wrapping around me like a vice. The whispering was deafening now, almost like it was coming from inside my own head. I wanted to shut it out, but I couldn't. I was lost in it, lost in the chaos. The figure on the screen continued to smile, but now it was moving, reaching out toward me. I could see its hands stretching out of the screen, as if it were trying to crawl through. Suddenly, everything went black. The static stopped. The whispering ceased. The shadow was gone. I don't know how or why it happened, but the silence was almost worse than the noise. The air felt heavy again, but there was no longer any sign of the presence that had been haunting me. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, feeling the weight lift from my chest. It was over. It had to be. But even as I sat there in the dark, I knew it wasn't truly gone. For the next few days, things returned to normal. The TV stayed off, the static disappeared, and I didn't see the shadow anymore. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me. I felt it, lurking just out of reach, waiting for me to let my guard down. I couldn't go to sleep without checking the TV, without making sure it was off. I couldn't shake the image of that face in the static, the twisted smile that had been so real. And I couldn't help but wonder, what did it want from me? Was it truly gone, or was it just biding its time, waiting to come back? I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for me. The TV has been off ever since that night, but I can't bring myself to turn it back on. I don't know what's worse, the silence, or the fear that whatever it was will find a way back in.